Hi everyone and welcome to Dance Podcast Season 3. I'm your host, Jasmine Cook. This is a dance science podcast presenting discussions with global industry leaders, aiming to make research and information more accessible and enhance dancer wellbeing, health and training at all levels of the sector. New episodes every Monday, 6 a.m. London time. Thank you so much to The Place for sponsoring today's episode. Located in the heart of London, The Place is a creative powerhouse for dance development that is leading the way in dance training, creation and performance. One of Europe's most exciting, innovative dance spaces, where artists from all over the world come to push creative boundaries, to experiment, and to perform outstanding new work. The Place is home to London Contemporary Dance School, a 288-seat theatre, an extensive range of classes, courses, and participatory opportunities for adults and young people, and professional development programs for artists. Check them out at @theplacelondon on Instagram, and they'll also be linked in the show notes. I'm so excited to bring you an episode today with the fab Liz Bayley. Liz was a professional dancer for 15 years, performing all over the world, including a year in Paris at the Moulin Rouge. She then specialised in Latin ballroom and Argentine tango. Her years as a dancer sparked her interest in sports injuries, and she obtained an advanced diploma in sports therapy in 2009. Liz then worked as a sports therapist in the West End on shows such as Wicked, The Wizard of Oz, Singing in the Rain, Shrek, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Chicago, Matilda, and Jersey Boys. She then graduated with a master's degree in physiotherapy in 2016 from King's College and is currently the physio on The Lion King, which I think is just the coolest thing in the world. And she has also worked in private sports injury clinics, in falls prevention services, and is a qualified DMA clinical Pilates instructor. She spends most of her time with the cast and crew of The Lion King, how cool, but also treats performers from Les Mis, Hamilton, Mary Poppins, Cinderella and many other West End shows with the company West End Osteopathy. Welcome, Liz. Have you got anything to add to that, or have I got most of it?
Yeah, no, I think you got it all and you got through the whole thing.
Amazing.
And the only word that tripped you up was osteopathy, which always trips me up.
Yeah,
always does. Yeah, no, I suppose the only thing not included in that would be just to say that I suppose my dance training, because this is so dance specific, this podcast, it's worth sort of saying it, but like everyone does, I was ballet trained from the age of 3, and I really was classical ballet for most of my dancing career until like I got to 16 and then dabbled in jazz and modern, which I adored. I was like, oh, there's more to life than just ballet. And I loved jazz and modern. And then when I got into my 20s and right around when I started dancing professionally, that's when I discovered Latin ballroom, Argentine tango. So it was quite late in my career, but it became what I did the most of. And I always add this in, like in 2008, when I was kind of at the height of my dancing career with my partner at the time, we were actually talking to Strictly about being one of the professional couples on Strictly. It's the kind of level we got to. We didn't get on it, obviously, so you can tell we weren't quite there, but nearly. And then the other thing that's not in that bio is just that my first degree was psychology. So I think it complements my physio really nicely because there's so much, it's the biopsychosocial approach, isn't it? But I don't remember a lot from it because it was well over 20 years ago, but my interest in psychology is what I carry through. So
yeah, that's definitely relevant. Thank you so much. So going back to West End Osteopathy, trip me up again. What's it like working as part of this team? So what do you do with them? Yeah, what's the team like? So you mentioned there's quite a few different sort of specialists within that.
Yeah, so West End Osteopathy is it's a really well-known company in the West End. It's run by a guy called Fabi. He doesn't even use his last name. He's like Madonna, like famous. He is like a legend in the West End, Fabi, and he has been treating for, I don't even know how long, but there's not many performers in the West End who haven't seen him and don't adore him. He's an osteopath. So he hires osteopaths, physios, obviously, sports rehabilitators, Pilates instructors, massage therapists. So all the usual stuff that you'd get in a clinic that manages injuries. And he uses us in different ways. So he wanted a physio for The Lion King because of the type of show it is. Rehab was quite important, obviously we still do the hands-on stuff, but yeah, the rehab is a big part of what we do, maybe a bit more than the osteopaths. But the nice thing is that we can work together and really use each other's strengths. So I think like I really compliment Fabi and he really compliments me. So if I get someone that really needs to see an osteopath, if obviously anything neck or back related, straight to Fabi if I can't handle it or think they could do better with him. And if he's got anyone from a show that maybe needs more dance specific rehab or a bit more physio based, he can send them to me or ask me to come into the clinic. His clinic is in King's Cross. So I work in lots of theatres, but also in his clinic from King's Cross. So we complement each other quite nicely. The other person that works on Lion King with me is actually a sports rehabber. So he's amazing at drawing up long-term rehab plans. So obviously I can do that, but he's just got a brilliant system where he's great on Excel and he'll plan it beautifully. So like we had so anyone who's got long-term rehab, so someone that's going to be off for weeks and weeks, it's good to be able to plan that rehab very carefully with progressions, and it keeps it clear. It makes sure we don't miss anything. So something I've learned from him is how to do that a little bit more systematically. So we'll work together and I'll say, right, at this stage, we need to be doing basic strength. Here we need balance. Here we need dance specific stuff. Here we need to start getting them back into rehearsals. Here, or before that, we need to get them into some dance classes. And we work together and then put that all into a nice clear spreadsheet, which is, I love. That's something that I hadn't done before, is being as clear with that. So the sports rehabilitator in the team has been amazing for that. Plus he can do everything the physios do. So he's wonderful. So it's very much a multidisciplinary team approach. Although I am in the theatres a lot by myself, you don't really tend to work together a lot, because it's like you're in the theatre by yourself, but you can contact the team. We're on WhatsApp constantly. I'm having a Zoom session with the sports rehabber tonight about a rehab plan. So we stay in touch.
Yeah, perfect. I want to come on to it more in a bit, but it just came up just now in my head, and I just want to ask, do you get many who are off for lots and lots of weeks, or is it usually more short-term injuries?
Yes, we have at the moment, I'm just trying to think, you do get lots that are off for quite a few weeks. Yes, across, like, you think the whole spectrum of the West End, obviously you're covering, tens of 20, 30, 40 different shows. Within that, you're getting quite a lot of people that will have injuries that will keep them off for a decent amount of time. You get loads of injuries that keep them off for 1 day or 3 days or maybe a week, or one show even. So you get a whole range of things. But yes, we've definitely had a few. And this isn't, whenever I talk about the shows, it's not just the Lion King, because we cover so many different shows as well. But we definitely do get enough injuries that are long-termers that need really decent rehab plans. Yeah.
Ah, that surprises me. I'm not sure why. I just didn't expect that, I don't think. So going back a little bit, you said about your degree in psychology helps because it's a biopsychosocial approach that you take to your work now. But how does your experience as a dancer play into your role now?
Again, your podcast is so dance-based. I think a lot of the people you've already spoken to are probably similar in this way. I think the rapport you have with dancers is just, it's kind of there. You don't even have to work very hard at it. As soon as you know you've both had a dance background, it just bonds you for life, doesn't it? I think knowing the terminology, knowing what things feel like, someone says, oh, I did it doing an arabesque. Great, I know exactly what that is. I know what it feels like. I've done it. I've been injured doing an arabesque. Or if it's doing partner work, I've done that. Obviously, I've had a lot of the injuries that dancers have had. I think you're similar kind of people quite often, like that kind of dancers and performers are quite passionate, bit emotional, so you kind of connect on that level, I think, a little bit too. But I do think it's important. I have to be really careful sometimes not to just to segregate that part of myself when I'm working with them sometimes, because sometimes it's good that you've both been dancers and you connect in that way, but sometimes you need to not be their friend. You kind of need to be their therapist. And I say that because, when you have a cast, they bond forever, don't they? They're best friends during the contract. And actually, I'm sort of part of that because they see me often. They see me every day. So when the performers come downstairs to go on stage, they'll all wave at me in my little room and I'll catch up with them. How are you doing? How's this? So you are friends with them. You can't do that job and not be friends. But you have to be able to kind of step back and be their therapist at times as well, and not, wear your therapy physio hat.
Yeah, I think that's really balanced. That's really nice. So going back to what I said a minute ago, what sort of typical injuries do you see? Obviously, there must be such a broad range, and I guess it varies show to show, depending on the amount of dance content, different things like that. So what sort of injuries do you see? And then I'll have mostly ballet-centric research so far, a little bit of other styles, but mostly ballet. So how do musical theatre injuries compare to ballet injuries? What similarities, differences?
As far as I know, there's not much research for musical theatre with the epidemiology of injuries. There's definitely one paper that someone sent to me, but there's not much. It's something that I really wanted to do because I feel like I'm in the perfect position to do it. Let's take a record of every injury we get for a year, you know, what is it, how did it happen, is it traumatic, is it overuse, what was the time off, you know, those kinds of things. And we're talking about doing that, but we're not even close yet, unfortunately. But just so anecdotally, what I see day to day, without a doubt, and I think it's probably be the same in ballet, but the top traumatic injury is the lateral ankle sprain. You know, it's not very glamorous, but ankle sprains happen left, right and centre. So that's one that you definitely need to be good at assessing, rehabbing. You know, you might want to work out, do we need to do something with the footwear, or do we, you know, are you taping it, or, you know, why are they, and also if they're having ankle sprains, do they keep having ankle sprains? Because quite often you'll see the same person come back. So it's like a chronic ankle instability type situation. That's something that became such an issue when I was working with a theatre school in North London, which is called the Musical Theatre Academy. This was a few years ago. It was such a big thing, the ankle sprain, that I decided to look at some research about how you can rehab it or how you can prevent it. That was the key thing. And what I ended up doing was taking the research that I could find about preventative chronic ankle instability and ankle sprains, and seeing what rehab they were doing to try and stop that from happening. And then what I did was choreographed a dance which included all of those moves. So it included balance work, hops, lateral moves, changes of direction. And I put it all to the music, the song Jump by I can't think who it was, but it was to like a nice jumpy bit of music. And I got them to do it after their warm-ups as part of their training. And I didn't, you know, do any research into what the injury rate was before and what the injury rate afterwards. But what I did get feedback from the students was that they felt after doing my choreography that their pirouettes were better. And I thought that was fantastic, because we were challenging their balance in different ways than they had before. And we were looking at their calf strength. There were calf raises in there. We were doing things with balance with their eyes closed. We were doing, like I say, lots of agility, changes of direction. So I don't have any hard data, but I know that they felt it benefited their performance, which I thought was fantastic. I don't know if it prevented ankle sprains, but I use a lot of that rehab with the performers that I see now, the professional performers. So it's just sections of, like I say, agility training, hop training, landing technique. But yes, so to go back to your question, the ankle sprain is a big one. But most of the injuries that we see are overuse injuries, and I know that you know that from all the people that you've had on in the past. It's like 60 to 80% of injuries are probably overuse. So under that bracket, you've got tendinopathies galore, lots of bone stress injuries. I definitely see probably more of those than, I don't know if I'd see more of those than in ballet. One thing about certain stages in the West End is they're often made of hard materials. There's one particular stage in the West End which is made of steel, and the show that does that show, the show that's in that theatre, sorry, there's a lot of jumping in it. So you do see a lot of bone stress injuries, and I'm getting quite good at working out if it is a bone stress injury or not, you know, because you do see them quite frequently. And they're the kind of injuries that will take people off for weeks, because you have to give them the time off for the bone to heal. But of course, while they're off, they're doing rehab, like I'm crazy about it. So by the time they come back, they're stronger, hopefully, than they were when they went off, and then we have a graded return back to the show. So with those particular types of injuries, I'll talk to the company about it and say, right, when they do come back, when we know their show fits, we're not going to put them into 8 shows a week, because we're probably going to get the same problem again. Let's put them in for like 1 show on, 1 show off for a few weeks and see how it goes. If they tolerate that, then we'll start to up their loading and kind of go from, you know, so the return to show schedule is really important for those kinds of injuries and other ones, but the bone stress injuries were particularly important. I suppose the main difference with musical theatre and ballet is the amount of upper limb injuries that you get in musical theatre, because I know in most dance, lower limb injuries are the key thing, foot and ankle, particularly in ballet, obviously for the point work. Interestingly, in Lion King, they do dance on point. There's a few girls that dance on point in a few different moments, but it's definitely not the big thing that they do. There's someone that's, she dances like a firefly, and she's on point in the Lion King. Just as an example. So you do still get those skills that are needed in musical theatre, but yes, you still get lots of foot and ankle injuries, all the low limb stuff, but you get lots of wrist is a big one in musical theatre because of the amount of puppetry work they do and the character work that they do and the partnering work and the floor work. So it kind of crosses over with like contemporary, because they do lots of crazy floor work in musical theatre. So yes, upper limb, lower limb, lots of neck stuff because of the puppets again. Necks, heavy wigs. There's certain shows like Cinderella, don't know if you've seen that one, it's got oh, you have seen it, I know you've seen it. Yeah, Cinderella has got some huge wigs in it and great big costumes. costumes that limit arm movement are interesting for shoulder injuries. I've seen that in a few different shows. So sometimes it'll be quite tight on the shoulder, but the performer has to gesture with their arms, and they end up getting like a subacromial pain in their shoulder. So I don't think you get that as much in ballet, probably. But yeah, there's a good balance.
Yeah, definitely. So I was going to say, actually, what's unique about West End injuries? So show to show, do you notice real trends depending on whether they've got big wigs or big costumes or different stages? Would you say that's like a factor that you really notice?
Yes. For example, in The Lion King, there's a lot of heavy puppets that go on the heads. So you're more likely to see neck injuries in that than you would say in Les Mis. They don't really have any headgear, you know, for example. Or again, if we go Lion King, there's a lot of puppets that are handheld. So you're far more likely to see a wrist injury in Lion King than you would in, I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah, like something like Tina, the Tina Turner musical. I've not seen a wrist injury in the Tina Turner musical, for example. So they are definitely more specific, I think. But The Lion King is the first show to ever have a full-time physio on it, to my knowledge. And I think it shows you that they take it seriously, that it is a very physically demanding show. So that's kind of why most injuries you'd probably see on The Lion King that you might not see in other shows, because if you've ever seen it, you can understand why.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's really positive that it's reflected in that they have a full-time physio. Sort of, could you give us a bit of an overview of some of the challenges of working in musical theatre? So in ballet, I think obviously there's still many challenges, but it's somewhat more structured from what I've heard from people. So they have sort of a show schedule, they know kind of their performances for the year. There are lots of challenges in musical theatre that aren't around in ballet. So for example, shorter contracts or not knowing where the dancers will be next, or a shorter rehearsal period. I know you mentioned last time as well, space, so physical space being a bit of a problem, warm-up time, things like that. Could you just tell us about, some of the challenges? That's quite a big question, sorry.
I suppose it kind of comes down to like the logistics of it all in musical theatre. I don't think you can really doubt that ballet is a little bit ahead of musical theatre when it comes to the dance science that is used. They're ahead with the research, they're ahead with applying the research as well. So I think musical theatre is still kind of held back. It's very traditional. We're very in the culture of it is still very much as it was probably 10, 20 years ago. Not quite, it's evolving a little bit. But yeah, logistically, I've noticed the barriers that you come up against is things that are really hard to change. So things like when the theatres were built in the 1900s, they didn't have like a physio room, they didn't have gyms, they didn't have spare rehearsal spaces because they didn't need them. Like no one was thinking that way in the early 1900s. So whenever I do physio with people in those theatres, like I'm literally in a cupboard, or there's one theatre in Covent Garden which has a club next to it. So one time we didn't have the room I would normally use for physio, so they rented out the club and I was doing physio in the bar, literally in the bar of a club. It was hilarious. Or like a company manager will have to give up their office for a few hours so that I can do physio in there. So the space is definitely restricted in theatres. You don't get any extra space. Some theatres, they're very few and far between, do have rehearsal space. So they'll have like a bit of space like in the basement or something that you can use for rehearsals or physio or warm-ups, which is an absolute gift. But certain theatres really don't have space to allow for the company to do a warm-up. So as much as they might want to do like a 30-minute warm-up together, there's nowhere for them to do it. And everyone would think, oh, but the stage is free. But the stage isn't free. You've got lighting, sounds, set, all of that stuff are doing all of their pre-show checks. So the stage isn't available. So where do you put 40 performers to do a warm-up? So things like that are really tricky. A lot of them will do their vocal warm-ups in the auditoriums, which is fine because you can just stand still for a vocal warm-up. Quite often, like in rehearsal periods, we had them doing warm-ups in the auditorium, so going up and down the aisles, which is genius. It does work, but it's not great. Like it could be better. So logistically, it's quite tricky, and then it's the timing as well. So even if you wanted to do, say, a company class, like partly because of space restrictions, but so when do you do it is the other thing, because if you want people to come in early enough, say, to be able to use the stage, you're probably having to get them in at about 2:00 in the afternoon, whereas their call time isn't until, say, 6:00 in the evening. So you're then getting them, say, set into central London 4 hours before they would normally need to. We know they're tired, so trying to work out when to do things is is quite tricky as well, because you want them to do the extra training or the supplementary training or the dance class, but working out when to do it is hard. And it's something that I work with them quite often on, especially because in the shows where they don't get a company warm up, you want them to warm up. So you're sort of like, okay, well, can you do it in the stairwell? Can you do it in your dressing room? You know, it comes down, can you do it side of stage? But also when you look at what they're doing to warm up, quite often, when I was a dancer, I used to do a few mobilizations and a few stretches, and that was literally it. And if you go down to stage now, that's what you see. In fact, I was on a theatre the other day, and I was side of stage, and the performers were all on the stage warming up, and I say that in quotation marks, but a lot of them were sitting in splits, or, you know, kind of doing a few pliés and a couple of down dogs and up dogs. But it's, with the knowledge that I've got now, it's not really sufficient for a warm up. And that's one of the things that I talk to the performers a lot about, like, how would you change it? So they need to get their heart rates up. They need to challenge their balance, do agility work, a little bit of specific muscle activation. Every single muscle group needs to be worked strength-wise, not just stretching. And yeah, definitely the agility stuff, and a little bit of landing technique, and a bit of, I said balance, didn't I? But yeah, it in general, when I see them warming up, especially by themselves, so when it's not led, it's not really sufficient. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in musical theatre, is partly it's a lack of education, and partly it's just like, we've always done it this way. Like, dancers have always mobilized before a show and sat in the splits, and it still happens a lot. I see it a lot, and it's something I'm trying to change.
Yeah, could I ask as well, so obviously it's probably difficult to try and make adaptations. I can't remember if I've got this later on in our outline, but difficult to make any adaptations or strength work and things like that in a show run. So if it's 2:00 and they have a 6:45 show or whatever, you probably don't want to be doing a full body workout at 2:00 that they're then going to be shattered for their 6:45 show. So is that another issue that you come up against, is timing of trying to make any long-term adaptations with a busy schedule?
Yes, it's such a good question, because that totally comes into the management of all of this, because we know that we want them to be doing supplementary training, or as we should really be calling it, just training, you know, cross training. But when do you do it? So you've got a load of people who are already doing 8 shows a week, who already feel relatively overloaded, and yet you're asking them to do more. Now, I know this comes up in training in schools, and the good thing about being in a school environment is that you can tweak the timetable. So if the school wants to take half an hour out and put half an hour in of strength training, they can. And I know it has been done, hasn't it? I know they did it at Elmhurst. I know they've done it. Yeah, I've heard it on a couple of your podcasts, which makes perfect sense. So you can replace things. Well, we can't stop the show halfway through and go, sorry guys, it's time for strength and conditioning. You know, so you've got this really heavy load of 8 shows a week, but you're asking them to do more. So how do you do it? And this is one of the things I've really come up against. I've also come in, remember, in this particular job after COVID. So not only are they overloaded with the shows, a lot of them didn't do as much as they normally would for 15 months. So you've got slightly deconditioned performers as well. So I think we've had a real, yeah, it's been definitely the most interesting time to come into it as far as injury prevention goes, but the most challenging. So what I try to do is either, like I said, get them to do some stuff in their warm up, because that's time that, one, it will get them stronger and hopefully start their understanding of how they can strengthen condition for dance in a time that then promotes better performance, because they'll be warmed up in a better way. So you can kind of insert it a little bit into their warm-ups every day, which is what I've done with some of them. And I'm just talking basic fundamental body movements, squats, rises, you know, press ups, planks, those kinds of things, just to get them a little bit stronger. But that doesn't overload them for the show, so it warms them up quite nicely. But then as soon as you start messing with someone's schedule, you've got to be really careful, because the last thing in the world I want to do is cause someone an injury because they're tired or overloaded. So you have to be quite brave changing people's schedules or adding things in. So like, there was another dancer, we added in some strength work for his legs. He was getting groin injuries and adductor injuries, and it kept coming up. And I said, right, let's try and just get you stronger. So we were doing some things with weights, which he's never done before. So we started really light, looked at form, you know, technique, and kind of slowly built it up over the weeks. And that was okay. And I said to him, just keep me posted. Let me know how you feel in the show. Let me know how you're feeling first thing in the morning, your levels of fatigue. So I asked them about their RPE, their rate of perceived exertion, which I know that other people often do with dancers, because how else do you monitor it, right? So I look at what we're doing, number of repetitions, number of sets, their RPE, tie everything together and then try and progress it slowly. So we're not overloading them enough that they'll be tired and get injured in the show, which is the last thing we need. And they'll trust me that what we're doing is the right thing. Because I think if you start throwing a load of strength and conditioning at people and then they feel worse, they're just not going to do it. They just won't. So you have to get their buy-in by kind of, if they're already in a show, you've got to go slowly. You can't just suddenly start at, say, 2 sets of really heavy 30-minute sessions a week. You have to kind of start a bit slower. But just go back to the logistics of it as well. Trying to do that with no equipment is difficult too. So like, I don't have a gym to do this. So a lot of the dancers have no access to weights. And yet I'm trying to get them to do strength training. How do you do that? So one of the things we've come up with, which is, this is going to sound incredibly rudimentary, but we have door weights in theatre and they weigh about 12.5 kilos. And I was like, oh, they're heavy, that's like a kettlebell. So with some of them, I've literally gotten backpacks and put door weights in the backpacks to get them to be doing like squats or single leg rises or lunges. And it just adds something to their routine. I mean, that is literally as basic as it can get, putting weight into a rucksack. And I'm trying to get some kettlebells backstage because I thought, well, we could definitely, there's space for a kettlebell, you know. So trying to be creative with the rehab and with literally next to no resources is really hard too. There's a stairwell right next to where my room is, and I use that stairwell for everything. Like we use it for low leg strength, we use it for cardio, we use it for plyometrics. I had someone that's recovering from an ankle sprain running up it just to get their ankle loaded, the calf complex. So I use the stairwell loads more than I normally would have. The other thing we do have is a springboard for Pilates side of stage. We actually do have one of those, but we never have access to it because the stage is always being used. So there's these barriers, you know, like they're really great. They've got a springboard for the dancers to work with, but there's this extra barrier where it's not available all the time. And it's already hard enough to try and get dancers to do training, extra training. As soon as you throw another barrier in, like, oh, but you can't do it before the show because the stage is being used, it just makes it even harder. Yeah, and so it doesn't get used as much as it could be used. So there's so many barriers that you've got to break down, and it is hard.
Yeah, definitely. So if I said that you could have your dream world, so you can have as the dancers or the performers for as long as you want before their show starts, because using the rehearsal period before might be some sort of solution to this problem. What would your, 2 questions, what would your ideal be? So how long would you have them for? What would you do in the rehearsal period? How long would they need before the show starts? And then my second question would be, what actually happens and what's the best sort of solution you can make around realistically what you've got? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I've said this to people that I've spoken to in the past. I think the only way we can really handle this is to get in before the show starts, which is what you just said, because if you're handed the performers as rehearsals start, in fact, that's almost harder than the show schedule, isn't it? And we know that rehearsals are so overloading that loads of injuries happen in those rehearsals. So we've kind of got to go in before that even happens. So to me, it's like once they get offered the role, we kind of need to think from that point forward, right, what does this role demand? What is your current fitness? What do we need to change? Or also, what's your history of injuries for the person, the specific person? Because the role has so many demands, but separate people will have histories of different injuries themselves or weak areas. So if we can marry those two up, which is kind of what I'm hoping to be able to do, I think we'd have like the perfect injury prevention plan. But it does take time. So if we're looking at adaptations, 6 to 8 weeks, I suppose, is realistic. You know, most rehearsal periods are 5 to 6 weeks anyway, I think. But if we had 6 to 8 weeks, yeah, well, for musical theatre, I'm trying to think what hours were, about 5 to 6 weeks. But that is them coming in at whatever level you're hoping to get. So let's say after COVID, everyone had been going on a daily walk and doing some stretching, and they were thrown into, you know, 10 hours rehearsal a day, high intensity. The choreographers have to get it done. They can't take it slowly. So it was tricky. But if we had 6 to 8 weeks, but before the rehearsal started, we had a few weeks of that, so maybe a bit longer, to assess the performers way before the show starts, way before. Find out what their needs are, find out what their injury histories are, deal with injuries that are hanging around then incorporate personalized or role-specific conditioning. So if you're going to be on puppets, you need upper body work, you might need neck strengthening, you might need plyometric work if you're a dancer, you might need to get them jumping on harder surfaces to prepare them for those really hard stages. We might need to get their, oh God, there's all kinds of things. But definitely certain roles, as we've already discussed, will require different programs. and then incorporate all of that so that when they go into rehearsals, they've already got a certain level of resilience. And then ideally, I think if we could have a little bit more rest allowed during rehearsals. I think part of the problem is that it's so non-stop. Once they start, it's like bam, 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 bam. There's no rest time really allowed. And that, of course, contributes to overuse injury. So if we can get in there early, assess thoroughly, get programs in place, and then just slightly pace the rehearsals a little bit more carefully, I suspect injury rates would drop. I have no evidence to show that, but from my experience of working with people, that would address all the problems in one.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds great in an ideal world. Perfect.
In an ideal world, it's not going to happen. But the one thing that can happen, and this is where I would say is that, this is why I love your podcast, Jasmine, because at least dancers might actually listen to this. So maybe that's not going to happen. Companies are not going to pay for the extra rehearsal time, all the extra physio that would cost, all the input. But if dancers can figure that out themselves. If you get given a role, find out what's involved in the role. What theatre will you be at? Speak to the people that have already performed that part. What did they have trouble with? What injuries did they get? What advice can they give you? And then you do it. I think ideally the company would help the dancers and the performers with this, but that's happening and it isn't happening, and I think it will come. But until that happens, if I was going back to be a professional now, I would change the way that I work completely, and I would take much more responsibility for myself. I wouldn't allow myself to decondition as much. I was a lazy ass dancer. I did nothing in between contracts. And I paid the price. I got injured loads. God, I was injured loads. And I always used to think, why? It's because I was so bloody unfit. Yeah. But particularly for musical theatre. So if you're going into a character role, or you're something that's really specific, or puppetry, you need to know what that performer before you did to cope with it, or the injuries they had, and then you can take that on yourself, and there's nothing to stop you doing that, just being more responsible as a performer.
Yeah, definitely. That leads really nicely into my next question. So I was going to ask, just as a side note, what's company engagement sort of like with the material and things you give them? So how willing are they to respond? But I think that kind of comes into this. So I'll ask you the actual question first. So obviously you're really passionate about dancers understanding the role of prevention, strength and cross training, and understanding that for themselves as opposed to just constantly trying to feed it to them as you go, or reactive treatment when injury happens. So could you tell us a bit more about this, and what sort of impact could it have if dancers really understood the role of this injury prevention, strength training, cross training?
I suppose the key thing for me is, like I said, I think the reason I get passionate about it is because I've been in that world, and I've struggled to perform because I was either tired or injured, and I didn't enjoy it as much. Dancing was a real chore for me quite often, and people always say, oh wow, you did what you loved as a job, and I'm sort of thinking, yeah, I didn't love it a lot of the time. Actually, I kind of resented it a bit, because I was put in a great big costume, or I was made to dance while I was injured, or I was just knackered, or whatever it was. So my drive for it kind of comes from the fact that I think performers can enjoy their careers more if they are show fit. It's as simple as that, really. And I just don't think people know how to be show fit. So when I spoke to many different people on different shows before we started up around June this year, so this was coming out of COVID, we did lots of phone interviews with the performers on lots of different shows, and we said, right, where are you? What have you been doing? And they would proudly announce, I've been doing my yoga daily, and I've been stretching and doing my 10,000 steps. And I was sitting there rolling my eyes going, oh, for God's sake, you're going to be asked to jump on a hard stage holding a really heavy puppet. This is not even close to what you need. And I sort of looked into myself and I thought, Liz, why are you getting angry with these poor people? And I realized it's because I thought they were kind of being lazy a bit, but I've already told you I was the laziest dancer in the world. But I think part of it comes from the fact that they really thought they were doing the right thing. They were proud to say they had done 10,000 steps a day and stretching. And these are performers who are already hypermobile. They don't need to stretch. It's the last thing they need. They need to strengthen. They need to challenge their balance, their agility, their endurance, So I get kind of frustrated, but I forget how much I've learned. And I have to kind of check myself and go, Liz, you were worse than all of them. You sat on your bum and ate chocolate in between contracts. So I think you asked about like how do they buy into it, didn't you? So some of them get it. Like the second I mention it, they're like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. And they really buy into it. And I come up with programs and we check in. And those are the ones that come back and say to me, I'm enjoying the show more. Like 4 to 6 weeks later. And it's not always the dancers, it's often the singers, which is interesting because they're less sort of, they tend to have less of obviously a dance background, but they very rarely do you get a singer that doesn't have to move in a show, right? So, and especially in The Lion King, the singers do a lot of movement as well, and a lot of it is with heavy puppets on. So there's been a few that I've sort of spoken to who have had niggly injuries, and I've said, right, let's get you stronger, because their dance background was quite minimal. You're asking singers to do an almost dancer track with the added load of certain puppets, and of course they get injured. So those ones, a lot of them are quite reluctant because it's not part of what they do. The one good thing about most dancers are used to training, they're used to that physical exertion, but not all singers are. So that's quite tricky to get them on board. But if you do, they really notice the difference, because actually the less fit they are, the more they get out of it. And they're the ones that say to me, yeah, that number's easier now. I don't dread it. You know, and to me, that's like, hallelujah. Yeah. So that is when I kind of think, oh, this job is really worth doing. And whether or not the audience sees the difference, I don't know. I don't know if their performance is objectively better, but subjectively it is. They feel like they're performing better and it's easier for them.
Yeah. So the typical dancer habit then of doing Pilates and yoga, which you've mentioned just there, it is something. So I think in some sort of credit to the dancers, it is something they're trying. They get the idea that they need to be doing something else, but is it good enough? I'll leave you with that. Anything to add?
Yes, and it's a very good question. I did a very specific tweet about this that kind of went a little bit viral because I think people really got it. Did you see that? I don't know. It came up in another podcast I'd done, and it's something that I had seen, and it kind of just it snowballed. And I was like, oh, I think I've hit the nail on the head. I think the problem is, and no, it's not the problem, it's how long it took for yoga and Pilates to become an institution for dancers. Because there's not, I don't know, I mean, presumably you've done yoga and Pilates, Jasmine. Yeah, right? I've done yoga and Pilates. I'm a Pilates instructor. There's not really a dancer out there that doesn't do it as cross training. So actually we're kind of winning. Like, they do get it to a certain point, but it's taken, God, how many years for that to become the norm? 20, 25 more? But it is the norm. That is our culture now. That is non-negotiable in my head. Dancers absolutely do yoga and Pilates, and it's, but the funny thing is, it's because there's similarities between yoga and Pilates to dance. That's why dancers love it. But I think that's the downfall, right? So I think we need to be getting dancers doing stuff that's completely different from dancing, because then you start to, well, it's better for overuse injuries. If you're doing something that's kind of similar to dance, you're more likely to get an overuse injury doing it, because you're still using the same, like dancers love bar core. Well, that's bar, that's dance, isn't it? So amazing that they're cross training, but maybe they need to come right away from that. We need to be doing stuff in a turned in parallel position rather than turned out, because you get all the extra strength benefit without the overuse. So to me, and this is what I've learned over the years and what I've taught to dancers about, come well away from that and start looking at strength training. Strength training to me is just like a whole new world, which I've discovered that I now do. And I feel the benefits. I'm not dancing professionally anymore, but I feel the benefits in my everyday life from doing it. But what I love about it is that it's so quick. Like, you know, a dance class is what, 90 minutes? That's ages, isn't it? But we also know that you only dance for 50% of that. So what a waste of time when you could be doing something more useful. Well, I'm saying that obviously with a pinch of salt. I love dance class, dancers should dance. But if they're going to be doing supplementary or extra training, why not make it really count? You know, so if you can do, say, a half hour to 40-minute strength workout, it is completely different from what dance gives you, but it potentially will give you better performance outcomes in terms of strength, jump heights, endurance. And the other thing is HIIT training. So a lot of the dancers I spoke to, like I said, they'd said, oh yes, I've been walking. What good is that for anyone? You know, the show you do is not you walking around on stage listening to a podcast. It's you running, hitting high intensity and then belting a note. So we need to replicate that in your training. And you say it and it sounds so commonsensical, but people don't do it. And this is why I get funny about it. So HIIT training, just high intensity cardiovascular training, really peaking their heart rates at, you know, 80 to 90% of their maximum, really, and often, you know, at least 2 or 3 times a week, to replicate the demands on stage, because dance is up and down and up and down and up and down. It's not a 45-minute walk. So trying to, and that again, HIIT training can be done quite quickly. So rather than sitting on a bike for an hour at just like, say, level 4, having a lovely listen to some music, do a 25-minute HIIT training session and really push it for 3 minutes, drop it down, push it for 3 minutes, drop it down. so that you get way more out of a 25-minute session. If you're going to bother training, make it count. And then I literally tweeted this yesterday, you get another half hour to go and have a coffee with a friend. Brilliant. So it's the intensity of training that I try to get across to dancers that we need to up. And dancers love to sweat, so they're not usually against this, but it isn't cultural for us, and that's what needs to change.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely know what you mean about we do it because we're good at it, because that's definitely something that appeals to a lot of dancers. We like winning, we're competitive people, and that's why Pilates and yoga sit well, because we're good at them. We can do the poses, we can do, it sits really well.
And you look gorgeous. Like if you go to a yoga class, you're the one that's doing it beautifully, and everyone's like, oh, you must be a dancer. And you're like, yes, I am. Yeah. But what's that giving you as a performer? It's not challenging you enough as a performer. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think Pilates and yoga are 100%. They're brilliant for active recovery, for the lower intensity exercise. If you enjoy it, do it. And of course, yoga has and Pilates and all workouts have the extra benefits of the mental stimulation or the mental health benefits. So I'm by no means saying don't do it, but I'm just saying look at what you do and maybe tweak it, because I think most dancers can get a lot more out of their training time if they're doing it, or if they're not doing anything, look at how you can incorporate all those different things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something I'd love to ask you more about it, but I'm going to keep it for another day, because I think I need to read up on it more as well first before I do ask about what the demands really are and what dancers need. Because I know I teach a lot of dance and ballet, and in the populations that I teach, so they're mostly recreational kids, but some of them come quite a few times a week and are starting sort of pre-vocational. And I think I really need to look at the demands of what they need, because we do a lot of Pilates. It's sort of just the way that it works in a lot of the schools I work in. But yeah, it's something I really would love to look into and see sort of about what they need.
I think, can I just say, is it Kim Hutt?
Yes.
You've had on the show. She's done some good research into this, looking at, I think she was the one, I listened to a talk of hers. She was saying about the VO2 max, and a normal dancer's VO2 max is only just above a normal sedentary person. Mm-hmm. But the requirements are way higher. I haven't got the figures in my head, but I think she's done, there's definitely research out there. All I know is if you just commonsensically look at what's required on stage and look at what people do as they're training, it doesn't even come close.
Yeah, it's definitely something to look into. So looking at dancers in training then in sort of performing or MT colleges, is there anything that they could be learning or doing now to prepare them for the demands and the typical challenges that you see in the working world? So if our rehearsal period, it's better than I thought it was, but if it's not quite long enough for what we would like, what can they be doing even already in college to be preparing them, sort of educating them from an earlier stage?
I feel like I answered this a little bit in another question, didn't I? I sort of said about the thing about taking responsibility. It wasn't so much about students, that was more professionals and students, but I think it comes down to that a little bit, is not relying on companies doing it for you, because I think a lot of them are, and you can tell because the people you've had as guests on this podcast are often working with those students. So they're definitely getting a lot of dance science input, and the education is way superior to what I had when I was dancing. But I think it's just taking responsibility, learning as much as you can, and knowing your own body. What else? The other things would be learning about not just load and your dance, but everything else that comes for well-being. So mental health, sleep and nutrition are huge for injuries. Mental health problems can lend itself very well to increased suffering during injuries, increased intent. And then also, like I say, nutrition and sleep. So it's all very well train, but you're not going to get stronger or better unless you rest and fuel it correctly. And I know that, but I'm not the one to necessarily give out the advice, but I know that's important. So if I pick that up from someone, I either will I'll refer them on to someone who can help them, or just at least flag it and just say, you realize that you're not eating enough for what you're doing, that's why you're knackered, and often it's not the girls. I always think it's such a stereotype that girls don't fuel sufficiently for their dance, but a lot of the boys that I speak to don't, from what I can work out. And just understanding basic nutrition, like knowing what a carbohydrate is, what protein is, what macronutrients and micronutrients are, and why you need them, and in what quantities, what you should drink and when, just simple stuff that will complement your training or your physical training for your body as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. And their habits, so nutrition, sleep, and being aware of those and looking after themselves, I guess, are habits that hopefully students are starting to make now, and then will carry forwards into their professional career, instead of starting I guess as the research evolves, hopefully they'll come through with it, as opposed to starting on the back foot and having to educate them, or trying to educate dancers when they're already in roles. Does that make sense? Like, hopefully
Yes.
it's come through. Yeah, it's coming with them now.
Mm.
I could talk to you all day, Liz. There's so many things I would love to ask you about. But the last sort of main area for today would be screening in the West End, or profiling. So what I think people would be interested to know, what's the protocol for this, for the shows you have worked on? So do you do it at the start of the rehearsal period? Do you do it at the end? What do you look at? What's it used for? And yeah.
Before we profiled a lot of the people for the West End shows opening this summer, we had a massive meeting in the company, and we said, right, what do we want to look at? This is it's an open book. You're the therapist working with them. What's important to you? And of course, you've got osteopaths in our company. You've got osteos, Pilates, physio, and sports rehabbers, and we all had completely different ideas about what should be looked at, which kind of shows you how broad a spectrum it could be. But if you look at the evidence, I don't believe there's great evidence to show that screening for certain things picks up certain injuries or can predict injury risk. From what I understand about it, I think as a physio, looking at function is the most important or the most useful way to use a screening or a profile type situation. So I was like, I want to look at function, please. So me and the sports rehabber came up with a whole load of functional tests that we could put the performers through, which I felt would give us more information about their ability as a performer, rather than looking at things like hypermobility, muscle length. We did look a little bit at muscle length, hypermobility or scoliosis, or something a little bit less changeable. You know, you can't really change those factors, but you can change muscle power or jump height, those kinds of things, or balance. So I said, let's look at those things. So we looked at things like measurements for performance. So we were looking at counter movement, jump heights, medicine ball throws for upper limb capacity, number of press ups people could do. We used a 3-minute step test for some people, which isn't meant for elite performers, but at a certain level, it will pick up if someone's cardiovascular fitness isn't great. And if if they don't perform great on a 3-minute step test, then you can say to them, look, you're about to go into a show in 6 weeks where you're going to be working really hard. You need to get your cardio sorted, and bearing in mind, this is all without equipment. As usual, it's very sort of low resources. We don't have force plates and lots of stuff to measure people, sadly. So you're trying to do this with the least amount of resources possible. We'd look at like single leg hop tests for distance, which is quite good at picking up imbalances, and also just finding out how strong they are before they go into rehearsals. What else? Star excursion balance tests, looking at ankle control. We would look at things like hip flexor, hamstring, calf length in various tests, just because it's useful to have. And then what I personally want to use that information for is that if you get an injury, you've then got a load of information where this is the kind of level we need to get them back to. And I use it constantly. I'm really happy to say that I do use it all the time. I've got someone who I was looking at their scores yesterday of what they could do when we first saw them, because they've had an injury which is about to take them out for 6 weeks. So I had her pre-rehearsal scores. I've got her scores now, right before she's about to go off because of an injury. And then we'll see how she does in the next 6 weeks. I want her to be better than she is now before she comes back to stage. So we did loads of all of those different tests and a few others. So profiling in that way, using functional methods and what they can actually do, rather than looking for things like, a dropped left shoulder in their posture. Who cares? Does it really show you anything? Or scoliosis. You can't change scoliosis. And at this point, they're in a show. So what am I going to do? Say, oh, you've got scoliosis. Usually they know about it. It doesn't affect the dancing at all. Or if it does, it'll come up and we can come up with some strategies. But there's a place for those kinds of bits of information in there. But I personally find that the functional measures are the most useful. And it really shows them what they can do, where they can improve. It gives you a place to come back to if you need to for the rehab. And I think I use that all the time with them. It's really useful.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. It's really positive to hear that they engage with it as well, because I think I would find that interesting. I think I'd love to track the progress. So yeah.
Oh, they love it. They're so competitive. They love it. One of them, I was getting them to do a hop test for distance, and she literally rubbed her hands together and went, oh, I love stuff like this. Or the
like that.
Yeah, or the 3-minute step test, like you have a graph to show them kind of where they are on it. Or the press up test, you can show them, are they where are they, where do they sort of come in a general population for their strength. And often a lot of them do very well because they are relatively fit, because their performance, but often they don't. And for something like Lion King, if they can't do 10 not even 10 to be honest, yeah, let's say 10 3/4 press-ups as girls, and then you're asking them to hold puppets that weigh 3 to 5 kilos in their arms outstretched for, you know, in rehearsal situation 3-4 hours at a time, they're not going to tolerate it. And that's all well and good if I can, but what if I pick that up the day before they go into rehearsals? It's useless, sort of. I need to know that a few weeks before rehearsals start at least, so we can at least begin to address those deficits in areas that might really matter. So that's, and we said logistically that's really hard to pull off, but in an ideal world, that's the kind of thing that would really make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. So my podcast audience is predominantly a combination of dancers, teachers, clinicians, and academics. So it's quite varied at the moment. So I don't know if there's a group in this that you feel particularly passionate about, or a couple of groups. And which one, yeah, if you could choose one, and what would your key take-home message be for one or a few of these groups?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I would segregate it out, but I suppose my main message would be to everybody would be to try to get dancers to start to embrace the importance of active treatment over passive therapy. And that comes up as me as a physio. People often turn up at my door and they go, oh, I need some physio. I say that in inverted commas. And basically to them, that means I'm going to lie on the couch and you're going to do something to me. And a lot of physio does involve that kind of thing, but we need to get out of the mindset that people are going to do things to you to make you better. And I wish that people would embrace the active part of recovery or prevention a little bit more. And that's a cultural thing. I think it's coming. So that's my main message. And it's me as a physio too, because I do manual therapy and massage all the time, but I kind of hate doing it, because I know that actually that's not necessarily the thing that makes the big difference. And it does with some people, and you absolutely need it with certain patients. I will always use it and it has its place. But I'm starting to realize how much more important it is for them to be more active in their recovery. So that's really, really important. And then just communicating, dancers and companies, dancers, physios, dancers between themselves, talk.
Yeah, definitely. I was speaking, I don't know if it got out before or after this one. It hasn't gone out yet. So obviously you wouldn't have heard it, but Megan Bain from Ballet Met, she's their athletic trainer over there. And she was saying the same thing actually about how, physio is a whole lot of different things. And she was really advocating for the active side of recovery and dancers helping themselves. So it's really interesting that you both said the same thing, because that was on, like 2 days ago. So maybe.
There you go. There you go. See, hopefully it's starting to, the people that work with dancers definitely know what needs to be done. So that means that the message will get there. Maybe it'll be 20 years from now until it's part of our culture, but it is going to get there.
Sure. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to mention or discuss today, Liz?
I had a question for you actually, Jasmine. It should be quite an easy one, but I was just curious because you've done a lot of these podcasts now, and you must have learnt a lot from doing them, and you're a dancer and a teacher. So how has it changed your practice, if it has?
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting question. So I just started teaching full time this September, and my brain at the moment is constantly ticking over. And I feel like I've learned so much over the last few years last 2 years, I think, making this. And I think at the moment I'm applying so much of it to my teaching practice that I haven't had a chance to do before. So before I was studying and I was teaching on the side. But now every single night I come home and my brain is just constantly ticking. And I feel like every child I teach is like a puzzle. And I'm thinking about all the different episodes. So like you were saying, like right back at the start about a biopsychosocial approach, my brain is constantly thinking like, this could be this could be this is why they might be doing this. And I think, there's so much. It's so funny. It's a good time that you ask, because there's just so much going on in my brain. I don't know if I could pick out one thing I've learned. I think that would be my answer. I don't know. Does that answer it enough?
Yeah, of course it does. I was just wondering if it sort of physically changed what you're doing with them, like if it changes the way that I suppose you teach ballet, don't you? So there isn't a warm-up. The warm-up is the bar, isn't it? Yeah. But I just wonder if like you would change the way that you started a class or ended it, or the advice that you give to the kids.
Yeah, definitely. There's little nuggets of things that I definitely try and apply. So for example, growing up, I definitely sat in the splits as my warm-up. And now I'm really conscious that my students don't do that. And I try and give them an active warm-up as best I can to try and instill that in them. So there's definitely little things that I pick out quite a lot. I'm trying to think what other things I would change. That's a good example though, a warm-up, is that I definitely try and do that.
Because I think the teachers is kind of where it starts with, but also working in the West End, loads of those performers are teachers as well. So I sometimes think, like I did a strength and conditioning class with a bunch of them, and at least 3 of them were teachers, and they were going to use some of what I had done with their students, and it was the 11 plus dance program, which I know you know about.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I was like, oh, here we go. It's infiltrating from, from me down to the students. So I'm hoping,
I use some of that as well. So I have bodycon classes, so I teach some students for ballet, and then I have them for their bodycon as well. And I definitely know that I've tried to vary what they do in their bodycon to what they do in ballet, because there's no point giving them the same, what would essentially be the same class twice. So I use quite a lot of the 11 plus stuff with them, because that's such a good question, Liz.
I was curious. I thought you've got all this knowledge now. Like, how has it changed what you do? So
I love doing it. The reason I love the podcast is because I love speaking to people, and I love chatting, but I love learning. I learn so much. It's amazing. So thank you, Liz. It's been such a pleasure to have you on today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to be asked. I look forward to hearing it.
See you later. Chat soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Tune in again next Monday, and in the meantime, follow @SideDancePodcast on Instagram. It would also be so appreciated if you have a moment, if you could please rate and review on Apple to help the podcast grow. Bye.